40,000 years ago, someone sat alone in the dark and carved 5 holes into a bone, spaced with almost impossible precision. Not to hunt, not to fight, not to survive the night. They carved it to make music. And that single detail should completely wreck everything you assume about ancient life. You picture a caveman scraping by, one crisis away from starvation, with no time for anything except staying alive. The evidence buried in the dirt tells a very different story, and it starts with a bone flute found in Germany. 5-finger holes, perfectly spaced, carved from a vulture's wing bone roughly 40,000 years ago. Whoever made it understood pitch, understood spacing, understood music as a concept worth spending real time on. That takes hours of careful, patient work, the kind of work nobody does while actively fighting for their life. So ask yourself the obvious question: where did that time come from? The answer starts with a single anthropologist, a stopwatch, and a decision to actually go and check the assumption. In 1963, Richard Lee tracked the daily hours of the Jew Hoanzi people in Botswana, hour by hour. Adults spent roughly 2.5 days a week acquiring food, about 17 hours start to finish. The rest of the week belonged to something else entirely, something modern life barely has room for anymore. This was not a fluke of one unusual group in one unusual place. The Hadza in Tanzania, the Ache in Paraguay, the Martu in Australia. Different continents, different climates, same result. 15 to 20 hours a week on survival. You statistically work roughly double that every single week of your life. Skeptics ask a fair question. Modern foragers are not ancient humans, so how do we know the pattern is old? The answer is written directly into bone, and it does not require any guesswork at all. Compare ancient hunter-gatherer skeletons to early farmer skeletons, and the difference becomes impossible to ignore. Farmers were shorter. Their teeth were riddled with cavities from grain-heavy diets low in variety. Their spines show arthritis from repetitive labor, bent and worn from decades of the exact same motion. Hunter-gatherer skeletons tell the opposite story. Taller, stronger, healthier teeth. Far less joint damage overall. Less repetitive labor, not more. The bones do not lie, and they do not exaggerate either. Now return to that flute for a moment, because it is not an isolated curiosity sitting alone in the archaeological record. In 1994, explorers entered Chauvet Cave in southern France and found something extraordinary. Paintings roughly 30,000 years old, horses, lions, rhinoceroses, rendered with shading, perspective, and motion. These were not crude scratches. This was skilled, deliberate art requiring planning and significant, uninterrupted time. Someone crawled deep underground, lit a fire, and spent hours, maybe days, painting animals no one required them to paint. Charcoal analysis later dated some of the drawings to a period spanning thousands of years apart from each other, meaning different artists, generations removed, returned to the exact same cave wall to add to a picture someone else had started long before they were even born. Researchers studying the cave floor found scattered torch-wipe marks and animal tracks layered directly over human footprints, suggesting repeated visits, not a single rushed session. That detail matters enormously. It means this was not a one-time act of creative panic. It was closer to a maintained tradition, revisited deliberately, across a span of time longer than most modern nations have existed. Not for food. Not for defense. For beauty. For meaning. Simply for something worth doing. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, archaeologists uncovered something even stranger. Shell beads, roughly 100,000 years old. Tiny, deliberate holes drilled through seashells, clearly meant to be strung together into jewelry. The nearest coastline sat 20 kilometers away. Someone walked 40 kilometers round trip just to gather them, then spent additional hours drilling each shell by hand with stone tools, purely to look good. No survival benefit, no practical defense. Just the very human urge to make something beautiful, apparently ancient beyond memory. These are not scattered, rare exceptions either. Sites across Europe, Africa, and Asia repeat this exact same pattern. Decorative objects. Elaborate tools far more refined than survival strictly required. Hours of focused work with no practical payoff. This is what people did with their time once food was already handled for the day. Now picture an actual morning inside one of these communities, reconstructed directly from the anthropological evidence. You wake with the light, not an alarm. The fire from the previous night still smolders quietly nearby. Breakfast is leftovers, and it is social. People talk. Plans form loosely, without anyone forcing the conversation. A small group might leave to hunt or gather, but only if it is actually needed that day. If yesterday's hunt succeeded, and food is already stored, nobody is required to leave camp at all. Instead, the morning might go toward sharpening a spear, weaving a basket, softening a hide, refining a tool. No clock, no supervisor. The motivation is competence itself, the quiet respect earned by doing something well. When hunting does happen, it rarely looks like the frantic chase shown in films. Humans are persistence hunters, uniquely built to jog steadily for hours until prey physically overheats and collapses. Sweating allows humans to regulate body temperature while running, an ability most animals simply do not share. So humans outlast rather than outrun, and the hunt might stretch 3 to 6 hours, including travel. By early afternoon, the productive part of the day is typically finished entirely. What comes next is the part modern people find genuinely difficult to imagine. Nothing and somehow everything at once. People rest in the shade. They talk. They play with children underfoot. They groom each other's hair, slowly, deliberately. They carve jewelry from shells, teeth, or bone. They nap without guilt, because guilt was never part of the equation. Anthropologist James Sussman documented that Jew Hoansi adults spend roughly 6 hours a day in what he calls social time. Not working, not sleeping, simply existing alongside other people, talking, laughing, telling jokes with no agenda attached. In a world without money, police, or written contracts, survival depended entirely on the strength of relationships. If people did not like you, they had no obligation to share food during a lean, difficult season. So enormous amounts of time went into those bonds, not because it was efficient, but because it was essential. Then the sun sets, and something remarkable happens that the daylight hours never quite allow. In 2014, anthropologist Polly Weissner analyzed hundreds of hours of recorded Jew Hoansi conversation, day versus night. Daytime talk stayed practical. Animal tracks spotted, which plants were ripening, complaints about unfair sharing. But around the fire at night, 81% of conversation shifted towards something else entirely. Stories, myths about the origin of the world, tales of ancestors who accomplished impossible things, jokes, distant adventures. Wiesner argued this is precisely where human culture was actually born, not in daylight, but in firelight. Gods, spirits, the deep past, the imagined future. Ideas only available once your stomach is full and you feel safe. And that surplus of unclaimed time is exactly where an object like that bone flute actually comes from if you trace the process backward instead of just admiring the finished result. Carving 5 holes into a hollow bone, spaced precisely enough to produce distinct, controllable pitches, is not a task completed in one lucky afternoon. It requires testing, failing, listening, adjusting, and testing again, the same iterative process any instrument maker still uses today. Someone had to blow across a badly placed hole, hear the wrong note, and try again the next day, and the day after that, with no deadline forcing the work to finish sooner. That kind of patient, repeated failure is only possible for a person who is not currently worried about starving by nightfall. It is a luxury, in the truest sense of the word, and it was apparently available often enough that multiple flutes from multiple sites across thousands of years have survived to be found at all. The same logic applies directly to the ochre pigments and shell beads found alongside these instruments. Grinding pigment into fine powder, drilling a shell without shattering it, take hours of undistracted, fine motor attention that a starving, exhausted body simply cannot spare. Anthropologists studying modern foraging societies describe something else worth adding here. Much of this skill was not invented in isolation by a lone genius sitting apart from the group. It was taught, sideways and downward at once, the way most knowledge moved before writing existed. An older child, already skilled with a blade, might guide a younger one's hand while shaping a similar tool nearby. An elder, no longer strong enough to hunt, might spend an entire unhurried afternoon showing a teenager exactly how a hide should be scraped to soften properly. None of this required a classroom, a curriculum, or a fee. It required exactly the kind of open, unscheduled time this video keeps returning to, spent in the company of people who already knew a little more than you did. So a full day looked something like this, pieced together directly from the evidence available today. 4 to 6 hours securing food or crafting tools. 6 hours of social connection, talking, grooming, playing, storytelling, teaching a skill to whoever was nearby and curious enough to watch. A full night of uninterrupted rest, undisturbed by any clock demanding an early start the next morning. And beyond all of that, unstructured time. Resting, sitting, carving, listening, watching clouds, existing without needing to justify any of it through output. Then, roughly 10,000 years ago, everything shifted, all at once, and there was no path back afterward. Humans in the Fertile Crescent began planting seeds and domesticating animals, and agriculture turned out to be a trap. Farming could feed more people. More people needed more food. More food demanded even more farming in return. Within a handful of generations, populations exploded, and hunting and gathering could no longer support that many mouths. There was no way back. Farming, whatever its costs, was now the only system large enough to keep everyone fed. And farming demanded far more labor. Plowing, planting, weeding, harvesting, storing, defending crops from animals and raiders alike. The skeletal evidence remains unambiguous on this point. Early farmers worked harder, ate worse, and died younger. Yet the population kept climbing regardless, and complexity followed close behind it, almost immediately. Specialists emerged. Toolmakers, potters, weavers, inventors, and eventually soldiers, priests, and administrators as well. Then came something entirely new to the species. Jobs, employment, the idea that your time now belonged to someone else. By the time cities rose from the ground, the original human rhythm had already quietly disappeared for good, replaced by schedules, replaced by obligations, replaced by the need to work most waking hours simply to stay afloat. Today, you likely spend around 90,000 hours of your life working, roughly a third of your waking existence. Your ancestors spent a fraction of that and filled the remainder with art, music, story, and each other. You call waking at 2 a.m. insomnia and reach for your phone, annoyed, wanting instantly to fall back asleep. They called it the quiet hour and simply lay there, awake, present, needing nothing from it at all. You chase an invented version of success, achievements, wealth, validation measured by standards, a system built after the fact. They woke up already enough, with nothing left to prove to anyone, least of all to themselves. You make art only if your job leaves you enough energy left over at the end of an exhausting day. They made art because they had the time, and because making something beautiful was simply part of being human. We are not a different species from them. We share the exact same brain, the same needs, the same instincts, but we have built a life so different from 99% of our own history that the distance feels enormous. We traded unstructured time for productivity. We traded firelight stories for late-night scrolling through other people's highlight reels. We traded 6 hours of undivided human connection for 6 hours split across notifications, meetings, and passing small talk. That flute, carved 40,000 years ago by firelight, was not a survival tool at all. It was proof that the moment survival stopped demanding every waking hour, humans reached immediately for something beautiful instead. Not eventually. Not once civilization arrived to permit it. Immediately, the very first chance they were given, which raises the only question actually worth asking by the end of this entire story. If given that same amount of unclaimed time again, right now, what would you actually choose to create?